Fate is rarely kind to younger sons, even those born in a palace. On December 16, 1790, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg was born, the eighth child of Duke Franz, and his future was shrouded in fog. In a world where land and title decided everything, he had neither. This became the starting point that transformed a poor prince into one of the most calculating politicians of his era. The lack of inheritance and the empty treasury of the small German principality pushed the family to a desperate move. At just 9 years old in 1799, the young prince was formally accepted into service in the Russian army. But what was hidden behind that brilliant uniform? A little-known fact is astounding. Leopold was so poor that his upkeep at the Russian court was entirely paid for by the treasury of Emperor Alexander I. He was a prince on the state's payroll, and he learned this humiliating lesson of dependence for life. From now on, he would strive for power and wealth at any cost. However, the boy living on someone else's money grew into a brilliant officer. The military campaign of 1813 to 1815 became his finest hour. His participation in the bloody battles of Kulm and Leipzig brought him not only fame as a brave man, but also the highest honors, the Order of St. George and a golden sword. He ceased to be just a poor relative. He became a war hero, a figure with a European reputation. It was then that his character was forged. Leopold realized that his greatest asset was himself. He transformed into a, quote, professional prince whose intellect, charm, and military merits were commodities on the political market of Europe. His goal was not service, but the search for an advantageous match that could compensate for the injustice of his birth. He was ready for any alliance to achieve his goal. When asked about his prospects in his youth, Leopold allegedly replied with a cynical smile, "I have only a head on my shoulders and a sword at my side that is enough for a prince." And soon, this cold calculation and that sword would bring him the most coveted prize in Europe. The cold calculation and sword upon which the young Leopold relied finally led him to his ultimate goal. On May 2, 1816, he secured the most advantageous match in Europe, marrying Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales, the sole heir to the British throne. This marriage was not just a political triumph that brought him a fabulous £50,000 annual income and a seat in the House of Lords. The unthinkable happened. The calculating adventurer truly fell in love. It seemed he had found his safe harbor. Contemporaries unanimously asserted that this brief period was the only time of true happiness in his life. Quote, "Never have we seen Prince Leopold so happy," wrote one lady-in-waiting in her diary. He literally glowed with love for his wife. The former poor relative who had lived on handouts from the Russian Tsar was now the husband of the future queen of the most powerful empire in the world. All of Britain held its breath, awaiting the birth of an heir. But fate, having lifted him to the pinnacle, was preparing a devastating fall. November 6, 1817, became a day of national mourning and personal catastrophe. After an agonizing labor, Charlotte died. The child the nation had so eagerly awaited was stillborn. In an instant, Leopold lost everything: his beloved wife, his unborn son, and the prospect of becoming Prince Consort of Great Britain. This loss broke him. He sank into a deep depression, wore mourning for Charlotte for 14 long years, and, according to those close to him, never fully recovered. Quote, "With her death, the best in me died," he confessed in a letter to a friend. "Now, I live only for duty and calculation. Yet, in this tragedy lay a little-known but crucial fact for his future. The British government, sympathizing with the widower's grief, allowed him to keep his lifetime pension of £50,000. Love was dead, but his financial future was secured forever. This capital, washed with tears, would become the foundation for his next ascent to power. 14 years of mourning and a lifetime British pension could have turned Leopold into a respectable recluse, eternally grieving his lost love. But behind the mask of the inconsolable widower hid a cold and shrewd player who was simply biding his time. He turned his grief into political capital, earning the sympathy and trust of European courts. And when a new state appeared on the map of Europe, he was ready to act. His chance came in 1830, when the great powers offered him the crown of the newly formed Greece. For any other prince without an inheritance, this would have been a gift from heaven, but not for Leopold. He refused, shocking diplomats. Why? The answer lay in a cynical phrase attributed to him: "Greece is too poor for a prince who is accustomed to comfort." He was waiting for a more valuable prize, and his patience was rewarded. Soon, rebellious Belgium, having separated from the Netherlands, began its search for a monarch. This was not a poor agrarian country, but a young industrial state in the very heart of Europe, a worthy goal for his ambitions. Leopold played his hand masterfully. He mobilized all his connections. He secured Britain's support as the widower of its princess, used old military contacts in Russia, and received the approval of France. He became the ideal compromise figure, acceptable to everyone. However, behind the scenes of this brilliant diplomatic victory, there were whispers of far less noble methods. Opponents claimed that the compliance of key members of the Belgian National Congress was generously paid for through British and Russian connections. Was the crown bought? There was no direct proof, but rumors of corruption cast a permanent shadow over his accession. In any case, on July 21, 1831, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg ascended the throne as the first king of the Belgians. He received his crown not by right of birth, but as the result of the finest calculation. For him, this was not just the acquisition of power. It was long-awaited compensation for his lost happiness and stolen future, a way to secure for himself the position he had so relentlessly pursued. Having secured a crown, Leopold faced a new state necessity. The country needed heirs, and the throne needed a strong alliance with France. The king's heart still belonged to the deceased Charlotte, but politics demanded sacrifice. On August 9, 1832, he entered into a second marriage, wedding Louise Marie of Orléans, daughter of the French king Louis-Philippe. From the very beginning, this union was a transaction, not a meeting of souls. The princess's own words, written to a friend before the wedding, sound like a verdict. "I give my hand as a sacrifice to reasons of state, not to a man." The marriage fulfilled its dynastic function flawlessly. Between 1833 and 1840, the queen gave birth to 4 children, including 2 future heirs, Leopold II and Philippe. But behind the facade of family well-being lay an icy void. Witnesses described dinners at the palace as a gathering of strangers at the same table. This coldness was so absolute that the couple not only lived separately, they occupied different wings of the palace. What was the source of this chasm? The answer hung on the wall in the king's private study. A little-known but cruel detail. Leopold commissioned a large portrait of his late first wife, Charlotte, and pointedly displayed it where he spent most of his time. For the young Queen Louise Marie, this was a daily humiliation, a silent reminder that she was merely a shadow and a political necessity. The courtiers, known for their cynicism, quickly grasped the situation. A biting joke soon spread through the palace corridors. The king speaks more to the portrait of his dead wife than to his living one. The official family had become a mere cover, a screen behind which the aging monarch, weary of loneliness and duty, would soon begin to build a very different, secret life. The icy halls of the royal palace and the cold bed of an official marriage could not long contain a man whose life had already been shattered by the loss of love. Tired of duty and loneliness, Leopold I found solace, or, as malicious tongues claimed, a new victim. Between 1842 and 1844, Arcadie Claret, the young daughter of a major in the Belgian army, entered his life. The contrast was shocking and indecent even for a court accustomed to much. The king was 52. She was, according to various sources, between 16 and 18. Contemporaries described her as a beautiful but simple girl from the provinces, dazzled by royal attention. Leopold, making no secret of it, rented a luxurious mansion for his young mistress on the Rue Royale in Brussels, turning a secret affair into a public scandal. Behind the king's back, people whispered that his behavior was unworthy of a monarch. The diary of the British ambassador preserved a scathing entry. "His Majesty is behaving like an old goat seducing village maidens." But was this just the whim of an aging man? A little-known intrigue that played out in the shadow of this romance points to something far dirtier. Immediately after Arcadie became the king's favorite, her father, Major Claret, received a sudden and high-ranking promotion. A coincidence? No one in military and court circles believed it. Persistent rumors spread that the father had effectively sold his daughter to the king in exchange for career advancement. Was it the seduction of a naive girl, or a cynical deal between two men, where youth and beauty became a bargaining chip? Whatever the case, for Leopold, this was just the beginning. He had no intention of settling for the role of a secret patron. This scandal was merely the first step in a far more cynical and sophisticated plan designed to legitimize his vice. Keeping a mistress was only half the battle. The main problem facing Leopold was far more complex: how to secure the future of the children who would inevitably be born from this union. In the 19th century, illegitimate children had no rights. But the king, accustomed to solving problems with calculation rather than morality, found a solution, one that was cynical and brilliant in its audacity. He decided not to hide his sin, but to legitimize it through a legal charade. In 1845, a cunning scheme was enacted. Arcadie Claret was married off to Ferdinand Meyer, the king's loyal equerry. This marriage was a fiction from start to finish. The details of the deal were striking in their cold pragmatism. Meyer received a noble title of baron, a wealthy estate, and a generous lifetime pension. In return, he had to officially recognize the king's future children as his own, and, most importantly, forever renounce any marital rights to his own wife. He became a husband on paper, a cover for the royal adultery. The court, accustomed to much, was shocked. The king was not just being unfaithful, he was officially formalizing his deceit, turning a loyal servant into an accomplice. A biting anecdote immediately spread through the palace. When Meyer was asked about his first wedding night, he allegedly replied with a wry smile, "My wife was very occupied with matters of state." This scheme was not just immoral, it was legally flawless. As one of the royal lawyers later wrote in his memoirs, "This is the most sophisticated violation of family law in the history of Belgium." Leopold had created a legal loophole that allowed his illegitimate children to receive noble titles and inheritance rights, while formally remaining the children of Baron Meyer. The legalized deceit was complete. Now the king could have heirs without fearing for their status. The path for the birth of legitimate bastards was open. The legal traps set by the king worked perfectly. The fruits of this cynical union were not long in coming. On November 14, 1849, George Frederick was born, followed by his brother Arthur on September 25, 1852. On paper, they were the sons of Baron Ferdinand Meyer, but all of Belgium knew whose blood truly flowed in their veins. In 1850, an event occurred that finally freed the king's hands. Queen Louise Marie, long suffering from her husband's coldness and tuberculosis, died. All pretense of propriety was cast aside. Arcadie immediately returned from a brief exile in Wiesbaden, and her return was triumphant. With the king's money, she bought the Chateau of Stuyvenberg, located in close proximity to the royal palace of Laeken. The line between his official and secret life was erased for good. But the pinnacle of this demonstrative audacity was an architectural one. For the convenience of his visits, Leopold ordered the construction of a covered bridge directly connecting his palace to his mistress's chateau. Now, his daily visits to his secret family became not just an open secret, but a part of the palace routine, sheltered from the rain, but not from condemning gazes. The financial costs of supporting Arcadie and their sons were astronomical. Over the years of their relationship, the king spent sums from the treasury and his personal funds comparable to the annual budget of a small ministry. At the same time, he was a surprisingly devoted father to his illegitimate sons. A little-known detail: Leopold personally selected the best tutors for them, ensuring they received an education that was in no way inferior to that of the legitimate princes. This double life could not fail to provoke the fury of his official family. In a letter to his sister, the Crown Prince, the future Leopold II wrote bitterly, "His Majesty cares more for his bastards than for his legitimate heirs." The chasm between the king's two families was growing, and it foreshadowed future battles over his inheritance. The death of Queen Louise Marie in 1850 freed Leopold I from the last shackles of propriety. The period of secret visits and veiled intrigues was over. The king, no longer needing to maintain a facade of family well-being, brought his secret life into the full public view. He began to appear openly with Arcadie at public events, in the theater and on walks, shocking his subjects with his complete indifference to public opinion. The reaction was immediate. The scandal, which had once been a topic for palace gossip, spilled onto the streets and into the pages of newspapers. Among the people, Arcadie became firmly known by the humiliating nickname, the Brothel Queen, while the monarch himself was increasingly called the Old Lecher. The liberal press did not mince words. One newspaper published a devastating article that left the king's reputation in tatters. "Our king has turned the palace into a brothel and the treasury into a prostitute's allowance." Contempt was shown not only by commoners. The aristocracy was also unwilling to accept the new reality. The height of social ostracism was an anecdotal incident at a ball. A noble lady, passing Arcadie, pointedly refused to curtsy. When met with a puzzled look, she coldly retorted, "I only curtsy to legitimate queens." But if he could ignore Belgian society, what about the rest of Europe? Here, the consequences were far more serious. European royal courts, bound by ties of kinship and strict protocol, refused to receive Arcadie at official events. This created constant diplomatic embarrassments and damaged the prestige of the Belgian crown. The Catholic Church, wielding enormous influence, openly condemned the king's dissolute behavior, which only fueled anti-monarchist sentiment in the country. The political opposition immediately seized on this. Leopold's personal disgrace became a powerful weapon in the hands of his enemies, who used the scandal to launch fierce criticism against the entire monarchy and demand limitations on royal powers. The king had won the battle for personal happiness, but was at risk of losing the war for his crown. The era of scandals, which had lasted for over 20 years, was drawing to its logical conclusion. On December 10, 1865, the first king of the Belgians, Leopold I, died. But even on his deathbed, his thoughts were not on the future of the state, but on the future of his secret family. Until his last day, he made amendments to documents, seeking to ensure the financial invulnerability of Arcady and their sons. When the will was read, its contents provoked shock and fury among his legitimate heirs. The king had left his longtime mistress a vast fortune, real estate, shares in the most profitable companies, and a colossal annual annuity. The cynicism of the situation was highlighted by a little-known detail. He bequeathed significantly more money to his illegitimate sons than to some of his legitimate grandchildren. The new king, Leopold II, took this not only as a financial blow, but also as a personal insult, the final stain on the dynasty's reputation. He immediately launched a lawsuit, attempting to contest his father's will and return the assets to the royal treasury. It seemed he had every chance of success. But here, he faced a crushing defeat. The cunning legal scheme constructed by the king 20 years earlier proved to be completely unassailable. Arcady's children were legally the heirs of Baron Meyer, and the lavish gifts from the king had been structured as donations, which could not be challenged. From the grave, the old monarch dealt his son one final blow, protecting his shameful legacy with a wall of impeccable laws. Society greeted the king's death with poorly concealed relief. For many Belgians, it marked the long-awaited end of an era of debauchery that had shamed the nation for so long. The outcome of this long reign was best summed up by Leopold II himself. In a letter to his sister, he wrote with bitterness, "Father left us a crown, but he stained it with his base passions. It was a crown that now had to be cleansed." When the curtain fell on the long drama of Leopold I's reign, the fates of the main characters diverged, leaving behind a trail of questions and contradictory assessments. The main heroine of this scandal, Arcady Claret, outlived her royal lover by a full 32 years. She died on January 13, 1897, at the age of 70, having spent the rest of her life in the luxury and comfort provided by the king's generosity. The woman once called the Brothel Queen ended her days as the wealthy and respectable widow of a baron, proving that sometimes a scandal can be the most profitable investment. And what of the secret heirs born from this union? The king's cynical plan was a complete success. Both sons, who bore the surname Meyer, had brilliant careers, fully integrating into the elite that had once scorned their mother. George became a diplomat and passed away in 1904, while Arthur rose to the rank of general and died in 1901. They lived their lives under another man's name, serving as living proof that a legal trick could be stronger than public morality. But how has history judged Leopold I himself? Over time, harsh judgments have been replaced by more complex interpretations. Modern historians increasingly see him not just as a lecher, but as a tragic figure. From this perspective, he was a victim of dynastic obligations, a man broken by the early loss of his one true love, Princess Charlotte. His scandalous affair with Arcady is presented not as a vice, but as a desperate search for comfort and warmth in the cold world of political marriages. However, another, much harsher view exists. A feminist lens sees this story not as a romantic drama, but as a classic example of the abuse of power. Here, Arcady is not a calculating favorite, but a victim of a system, where young and dependent women were used to satisfy the whims of aging rulers. Her story becomes a symbol of exploitation, hidden behind the glitter of the royal court. One thing is undeniable. This prolonged scandal dealt a serious blow to the reputation of the Belgian monarchy. It fueled Republican sentiment in the country and forced subsequent kings to be extremely cautious in their personal lives, understanding the reputational damage a single misstep could cause. The story of Leopold and Arcady transcended personal drama, becoming a textbook example of the double standards of the 19th century elite and an eternal reminder of the price paid for the abuse of power. As one modern Belgian historian put it, Leopold I showed that even the noblest of princes can fall victim to their own weaknesses, but the price of their fall is the trust of the people.